Good morning, fellow religious sisters and Father Emil. We will now begin today's webinar with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Awareness of God's presence. Come, here and now. God invites you. Be present. He is here, within and around you. Remain. Let me be your stillness. With a gift of consecrated chastity, we respond to God who has first loved us. In apostolic fecundity, we await for the Lord's return. Love generates apostolic fecundity and teaches us to fulfill our mission as witnesses to the tenderness of God for His creatures. Take possession of my heart and dwell in it, contain it and fill it. You who are higher than the heights of my spirit and closer to me than my innermost self. Your faithfulness and love. You are the pattern of all beauty and the seal of all holiness. Set the seal of your likeness upon my heart. In your mercy, set your seal upon my heart, God of my heart and my portion forever. Amen.
May I now call on Sister Nympha Ebora of the Pious Disciples of the Divine Master and chairperson of the Association of Women Formators of the Philippines, or AWFP, for the welcome remarks.
Hello and good morning to all of you who are joining us today. We welcome you to this webinar series that takes the place of our biannual National Convention. Had COVID not come, supposedly by this time around, 300 formators would have gathered in Cebu, the cradle of our Christian faith. That is why our topic for this webinar are in line with the celebration of the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines. Thanks to technology, we do not need to cancel the convention. And today we are here together virtually, being joined not only by formators, but also by other women religious. We have 70, at least, congregations who register for this event, or at least 484 participants in this webinar from the different parts of the Philippines and abroad. Dear friends, our moderator for today's webinar is Sister Ana Cielo Mantuloy, RGS, Assistant Secretary of the Association of Women Formators of the Philippines. I now give the floor to Sister Cielo.
Thank you, Sister Nympha. Once again, a pleasant morning to all. In a while, we shall be listening to the presentation of our resource speaker on the topic, History of the Philippine Church and Role of Religious Women. This will be followed by an open discussion where you can raise questions or share reactions, insights, or reflections. For the efficient flow of this segment, kindly follow the ground rules that were shown on screen before the webinar. But allow me to repeat them. All attendees' microphones have been muted and their videos disabled for the entire webinar. For the open discussion and question and answer, Attendees are requested to type their questions or clarifications in the chat box for Zoom or on the comment section for those watching on Facebook. You may also send them through text to 0977 607 9028 or 0920-818-1554. So as not to miss a question, attendees are requested to refrain from posting any other comments or remarks once the talk has started. Only questions, clarifications, and shared insights will be posted or sent through text. However, we will gladly welcome your other comments and remarks about the webinar after the question and answer segment. The moderator will read the messages sent and refer them to our resource speaker, who will communicate her response verbally for everyone to hear. Finally, may we remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. Thank you in advance for your cooperation. We will now have the introduction of our resource person by Sister Marie Jonah Rosales, SPC.
Hello. Our resource person for today is an Augustinian Recollect friar who hails from Cavite. He studied philosophy at Casiaco, Recoletos Seminary in Baguio City, and theology at Recoletos Formation Center. He professed as a religious in 1986 and was ordained priest in 1992. He was then missioned as assistant parish priest of San Sebastian Basilica in Quiapo, Manila. In 1994, Father was sent to Rome, Italy, for his further studies. He obtained his licentiate in church history in 1998 and later doctorate in church history in 2008 in the Pontifical Gregorian University. Father has written and contributed historical articles in various books and journals, a sought-after speaker at that, on various topics on history. He has given talks locally and internationally. From 2009 to 2019, he served as Dean of Studies of Recoletos School of Theology in Quezon City. At present, he is teaching church history at the Recoletos School of Theology and San Carlos Graduate School of Theology, Central Seminary in the University of Santo Tomas, and Immaculate Conception Major Seminary in Giginto, Bulacan. We are blessed to have him today, and I am privileged to introduce him to you all. My dear sisters and friends, to talk about history of the Philippine Church and the role of women religious, let us warmly welcome Reverend Father Emilio Edgardo Quilatan, OAR, Doctor of Church History.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat, mga kapatid ko kay Kristo, lalo na sa mga women religious of the Philippines, na nakikinig sa webinar na ito. Na ang ating paksa ay Looking Back, Philippine Church History and the Role of Women Religious. Ako natap bilang isang speaker because I am one of the church historians here in the Philippines, Filipino, and one of the early evangelizers of the Philippines, ang Augustinian Recollects. And like the Dominicans and the Jesuits, and the Augustinians, we also promoted native vocations for women na gusto kong i-share sa inyo, which I would like to share with you today. And as co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord, let us go back to history now. And whenever we read history, let us have an open mind. And in that open mind, do not let our present standards, our present criteria, judge the past. And that is unfair because the past has its own criteria or standard, which is different in the 21st century. So the reason why I chose a topic, very specifically the misunderstood topic, was the Spanish period, from 1565 to 1895. That is the time frame that I chose because from that time frame we would like to understand why women were treated so during the Spanish colonial period, especially those applying for religious life. Okay? So what was the ambience at that time? What was the standard at that time? Why the Spaniards, both civil and church leaders, treat the Filipinos, which is for us, different, as of today, different, For us, for us, the way we look at it, it was discriminatory. For us, it was injustice. Okay, but at that time they did not see it that way because their worldview was different. That's why allow me to give you the ambience. What was the political and religious scenario at that time when women were applying for religious life? They wanted to become consecrated religious as we know today, canonical religious, but that was difficult at that time to attain. Why? Okay. First, let us see the political and the governance of Spain during the colonial period. And this system was called the Patronato Real de las Indias, the royal patronage of the Indies, in which the popes, that particularly Pope Alexander VI and Julius II, gave certain rights to the Spanish monarchs in supervising, managing their colonial churches. Because at that time, the Vatican had no office or organism to supervise the foreign missions outside Europe. Only the Spanish monarchs had that power and the manpower to do it. So it was granted to them because one of the reasons why Spain was allowed to stay in the discovered places outside Europe, especially Latin America, the Antilles, and the Philippines, is that they were given that privilege to Christianize, or in our Vatican II term, evangelize the natives in the lands that they would discover and conquer. Okay? And this system, which Julius II in 1501 in his papal document, Universalis Ecclesiae Catholicae, granted the Spanish monarchs. That's why the leaders of the church in the colonies, including the bishops, the major superiors in the colonies, the prior provincials, were also considered during the Patronato Real system as advisors of the colonial government. So, in other words, the church and state in the Patronato Real in the Spanish colonies were united. There was no such thing as separation of powers. There was no such thing as separation of church and state. Everything is united under the Spanish monarch, both the civil and ecclesiastical leaders. Especially, the civil authorities would consult all matters important, asking the advice of the bishops and the major superiors. That's why, in exchange for these services rendered for the work of evangelization, the Holy See recognized the Spanish monarchy to possess that just title to the colonies in the conquered areas of Spanish America and the Philippines, the title called Patron, the patron of the church in the Indies. This conferment was given by the popes, especially Pope Julius II, in order to see to it that the church in the colonies would be supervised better than the Vatican at that time. Because if you talk about the patronage, the Spanish monarch is considered in our own lingo today the vice pope of the churches in the colonies. So, in virtue of the patronato real and the king as the patron, no, he receives certain specific privileges recognized and tolerated by the Holy See at that time, no, pertaining to church administration and church personnel management in his overseas dominions. And what are those rights? So, let us review them. So, in order to understand how the church was managed during the Spanish colonial period under the so-called royal patronage. First, the right and privilege of assigning missionary groups concretely to mission-sending religious orders to territories for whose evangelization they were to be responsible. In other words, the king was given the right to choose a religious order, no, with specific function in a certain territory to evangelize. Okay. The second right, no, if he will give to the Francis this area of evangelization, that is for them, and we might say the king has the second right to choose what religious order to be sent to the mission territories, to be taken out or to be retained. That was his right. Now, if that privilege of approving, we might say, the missionaries there to be sent and to be retained or to be taken out, no, there's that, we might say, another, privilege. The right and privilege of nominating to the Holy See the occupants of the dioceses. In other words, no, when a diocese is vacant, no, the King of Spain can submit 3 names of candidates to the Holy See, and it is to be a tacit approval that one of these names should be chosen to be the next bishop. Okay? It is a pro forma that is to be automatically accepted because this was the prerogative of the Spanish monarch. No? Number 4, the right and privilege of approving through the viceroys and governors of the colonies the appointments of parish priests made by bishops and made by the prior provincials in the colonies. In other words, no, the representative of the King of Spain in the Indies, the civil authority, is the governor, especially in the Philippines. And he has the right to approve, no, who will be the next parish priest in a certain parish, as presented, if he is a diocesan priest, the bishop, or if he is a religious parish priest, the prior provincial. So, in other words, all towns, all parishes, no, were to be approved by the king through his governor general, not the bishop. Okay. Number 5, the right or privilege of having all correspondence between the Holy See and the Church in the Indies, but any communication of the Pope for the bishops in the colonies should pass through the council of the king for approval. That's the reason why during the Patronato Real from 1565 to 1898, the Vatican, Rome, had no direct communications with the Philippine bishops at that time. Every communication, every report should pass through the nuncio in Madrid. No? That's why, no, when the Americans took over, it was difficult for the Vatican, no, to determine the situation because they did not know what was happening for the past 300 years. That's why all communications from the Vatican were examined by the King's Council before it would be delivered to the colonies. And number 6, the king had the right and privilege of assigning civil functions to church personnel. Aside from being pastors of parishes, chaplains, the priests have 21 civil functions during the Spanish regime. That's why both civil and ecclesiastical functions were in the hands of the parish priests. So the parish priests were also the representatives of the Spanish king's interests in the colonies. Now, how about the women? Okay. The women played a very important role, but they were not emphasized so much in our history books. But allow me, remember, I'm availing of much of the studies made on the religious women in the Philippines during the Spanish regime, made by the late Dr. Luciano P.R. Santiago. And I have some resources and have some primary sources in our archives. That's why I have to read between the lines and share with you what was really happening during that time. So, what was the first canonical monastery established in Manila? The only monastery in Southeast Asia. That was the Monasterio de Santa Clara. And the old foundation was just located beside Fort Santiago in Intramuros. And the founders of this one was Mother Jeronima de la Asuncion, a poor clear nun. So, Mother Jeronima with 7 poor clear nuns arrived in Manila in that year. But on October 31, 1621, the Monasterio de Santa Clara near Fort Santiago was inaugurated and was occupied by Mother Jeronima and 7 poor clear nuns. Thus, the Santa Clara Monastery in Intramuros was the first of its kind in the entire Asia, and it became the model of all contemplative houses thereafter. But there was a problem. What was the problem? Because of a Spanish law, non-native Filipina or India could be accepted in the cloisters. Mestiza, Chinese or Spanish were to be studied before admitted. They can only accept Spanish maidens, Catholic maidens. And that was the struggle of Mother Jeronima, who wanted to establish a second monastery in Pandacan for Filipina natives. But this was rejected by the Spanish colonial authorities. But fortunately, within these walls, 2 native Kapampangans were able to enter the cloister, but with certain conditions and difficulties. Who were they? The first one was Sor Marta de San Bernardo. She was from Pampanga, and she was termed as Ladina. When you talk about being a Ladina, a Kapampangan at that time, remember the Kapampangans were given privileges by the Spanish colonial authorities in the Philippines. And many of them were members of the nobility called the Principalalia class. This Sor Marta de San Bernardino was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis in Pampanga, and she gave testimony of the heroic virtues of Mother Jeronima de la Asuncion during the examination of the tribunal, because she was a candidate, Mother Jeronima, for beatification. And many were in, she was staying with the poor clear nuns, and the poor clear nuns saw in her a genuine vocation. Okay, but that's why the Franciscan Chronicles says she was so influential a woman and so moral and virtuous. And the poor clear nuns wanted to have her and join to have her join in the monastery. Okay, but the problem was the Franciscan prior refused the acceptance of Sor Marta. So she had to wait. The poor clearness, most of them were Spaniards and Mexicans. They were looking for a way to have Sor Marta join them. And there was, in 1633, a chance. And what was that chance? The poor clear nuns were given permission to open their second monastery in Macau, China. And Macau, China was a Portuguese colony. And because of that, that was a chance for Sor Marta to be accepted in the novitiate and later have her profession as a poor clear nun. And they were able to turn around the law. So, the prior provincial relented and allowed Sor Marta to become a novice. provided her habit taking should be done at sea and her profession should be done in Macau, free from the Spanish laws in the Philippines. She was the first Filipina nun, India, of the Poor Clare nuns, no, in its history in the Philippines. No? Now, when Portugal was able to overthrow the Spanish influence in Portugal and in Macau, and ordered all Spanish nuns to go back to the Philippines, Sor Marta refused, because once she would go back to the Philippines, something terrible would happen because of the Patronato Real prohibiting her and questioning her vocation as a native Indian. So she decided to stay in the Poor Clare Monastery in Macau, and she died there. We do not know the date of her demise. The second one was Sor Magdalena de la Concepcion. She was admitted to the monastery in 1636, and we do not know what happened to her, but according to the chroniclers, that she persevered for 49 years and died in the order of sanctity in 1685. So there were the first two nuns during the patronal were able to overcome the laws of the Indies, no, that prohibited India, native women, to enter the cloisters, the only canonical cloisters of the monastery of Santa Clara. Okay. So, fortunately for the two, the two Kapampangans, Sor Marta and Sor Magdalena, they were able to enjoy this we might say vocation as non-canonical nuns. Others were not. They were not. Okay. Because the law was so severe, they have difficulty of joining the monastery of Santa Clara, even Filipino women, no? And they had the vocation to become a religious, and this was denied of them because of the patronatorial system. Okay, there was another way, and that way was becoming a beata. Okay, no. These biased Spanish laws did not dampen the spirits of the first Filipina religious. Actually, beata was not a religious, canonically speaking. But the vocation of the beatas, were already being acknowledged in the Spanish colonial society, especially in Latin America. And the model of this becoming a beata was Saint Rose of Lima. And she was the model beata, and she was revered as a saint in the Spanish colonies. So, becoming a beata was not alien to Spanish society at that time. Though it is uncanonical, not acknowledged by the church, it was protected by the Spanish monarch. And that is the prerogative of the Spanish monarch, to protect those under the religious orders, women who were called beatas. So, this is the beginning of the Filipino native vocation that would influence the history of other congregations, local congregations of women in the Philippines, and even in the American period, which I'm going to share with you, the vocations, being accepted by foreign congregations. Okay. What is a beata? Or who were the beatas? They were native women or mestiza women voluntarily living a solitary life or common life devoted to pious exercises. It had no official canonical status in the church as a convent of nuns or a religious order would. However, since they were under the guidance of the religious orders, the beatas received the investiture of the third order and live according to the rule of life of the said order. A group of beatas living in a house was called a beaterio. So, this is now the beginning of the beaterium, which began to flower in the Philippines only in the first quarter of the 16th century. Okay. There were three kinds of beatas in Spanish Philippines. First was called the solitary beata. She would live outside of her home, outside of the town, as if she was a anchoress. Second, the household beata. These are beatas living with their family, promising the three vows in private. However, she had a normal life, except she was shunning away from the social gatherings and events of the family of the town. She only stays in the house and goes to church and do some acts of charity. These are called household beatas. And the third one that is more dominant and long-lasting were the communal beatas. These are group of beatas living together in one roof, electing their own superior, and receiving protection and spiritual direction from the religious order, whom they were accepted as members of their third order. So allow me to share with you these communal beatas that became a dominant part of forming native vocations of women in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period. The Beatas were trailblazers of promoting a unique consecrated life that was not recognized by the colonial church in the Spanish colonies, but protected by, ironically, by royal patronage thanks to the intercession of the provincials. However, their existence was at the mercy of colonial politics dominated by men at that time. At the same time, these men were administering the Spanish colonies. And who were they? These were the crosses of the beatas trying to live the religious life. First, the Archbishop of Manila or the local bishops, where the beaterio is located. Second, the Governor General as the vice patron of the King's official, thus the King's official representative in the colony, who had the prerogative whether to implement or not the royal decrees coming from Spain, especially coming from the king. And lastly, the prior provincial of the religious orders, which supervise the beatas communities since they belong to their third order. Okay. That's why, notwithstanding the fact that the religious orders or the founded or recognized the beatas, they often disagree of how the beaterio defined its way of life and how it was to be governed. Hence, the beatas had to contend with these three factions: the bishops, the governor general, and the prior provincial. Yet, they are nominally united as servants of the Spanish monarch, but they fiercely independent of each other. They have their own interpretations of the law. And in between their quarrel, the beatas were caught in the crossfire. Okay? Often, they had conflicting views in defining and running the beaterios. As a result, the three male factions in the Spanish colonial power made the beatas suffer considerably because those men of the cloth and of robes did not fully appreciate the women's religious vocation, native or mestiza, and the depth of their commitment to their spiritual and temporal tasks. Now, these are the things that we have to be aware of. The beatas were the trailblazers of native Filipina consecrated sisters. That's why the charismatic perseverance of the beatas, who were considered second-class sisters or little sisters in a male-dominated world, was very, very appreciative in history. However, their charismatic perseverance were rewarded because the native women were admitted in the Spanish code as sisters of obedience, a loophole which they could be a sister of, or an affiliate who performed the most humble task in the convent, thus achieving a new depth of heroic virtues in the vineyard of the Lord. Okay. Next, the beaterios of Mother Ignacia and Mother Francisca, that is Santa Compañía de Jesus and the Santa Catalina Beaterio, were later allowed to profess only simple vows for the sisters who were still alive after a period of formation. However, for the beatas of the Beateries de San Sebastián de Calumpang and the Beateria Santa Rita de Pasig, they were not permitted to take the vows by the prior provincial of the order. They will only take the vows only in articulo mortis, only when they are dying. In spite of the fact that these beatas had been observing the evangelical councils in private for the most good part of their lives. And this was the order of the king. Remember, for them not to be, we might say, persecuted by the Archbishop of Manila, and the Governor General, the prior provincials asked the king to give their beatas a royal protection. And one of the conditions for the royal protection, especially to the Beaterio de San Sebastian de Calumpang and Santa Rita de Pasig, that the beatas were only allowed to take the vows, their final vows, only at the point of death. Yet the beatas persevered. Okay. Observations. The history of the 5 beaterios located in Manila, 3 in Intramuros, 1 in San Sebastian de Calumpang, and the other in Pasig, has these 4 basic common characteristics. They shared these common characteristics. First, all the 4 beaterios and the other beaterios outside of Manila did not obtain juridical status. They will only obtain juridical status after the Spanish period, 1898. Second, the Council of the Indies refused to recognize the religious character of the beaterios. After long negotiations, the beaterios were only given the approbation by the Council of the Indies under the king as houses of retreat, recogidas, and educational establishment for young Indians. And such establishment would be under the care of the mature women of good life and example, the beatas. Thus, the beaterio would become a school for young girls. Okay, that was allowed by the Council of the Indies in order to support the beatas and the beaterio. Third, the civil authorities in the archipelago would not see positively native women would be living in community, professing religious vows and vesting a religious habit, and not paying the required tribute to the government. They're neither fish nor fowl. Kung sa Tagalog, hindi naman arena, hindi naman isda. Pag pinaghalo mo ang resulta, fishball. Okay? Because they're wearing a habit, but they are not religious. So the only way to save them from harassment from the colonial government that they are required to pay the tax. One of the requirements of one of the privileges given by the royal protection by the Spanish monarch is that they are exempted from paying the colonial taxes or the tribute. Okay, these were given to the beaterios by the Spanish monarch. Fourth, the ecclesiastical authorities also shared the same ideas with the civil government. Of course, the church was not disposed to permit such simple way that women be exempted from ecclesiastical jurisdiction. So, this was the conflict between the prior provincials and the Archbishop of Manila. Since they belonged to the third order, the Archbishop of Manila had no jurisdiction to the beaterio, of which the bishop at that time had to monitor these beaterios. But since they belong to the third order, they were exempted from the jurisdiction of the bishops. That's why the conflict between the prior provincial and the Archbishop of Manila affected the lives of the beatas, especially in the history of the Beaterio de Santa Catalina de Siena. They suffered an exile for 2 years because of a disagreement between the Governor General and the Archbishop of Manila and the prior provincial of the Dominicans. The question of canonical jurisdiction. And fifth, all beaterios were born and developed under the protection of the religious orders. And since they are under the protection of the religious and as third orders, they share their charism with these women. Charism and spirituality. And so, this spirituality helped develop the women, the feminine branch of the congregation of each religious order, who are overseeing their spiritual life. Whoever is in charge, the provincial, he will appoint a spiritual director belonging to the same order to the beaterio under their care. A Dominican beaterio is under the Dominicans. The San Sebastian beaterio was under the Recoletos. The Beaterio de Pasig was under the Agustinians. And the Beaterio of Mother Ignacia was under the care of the Jesuits because the spiritual director of Mother Ignacia was a Jesuit. So that's it. So, the development of the spirituality of each and its charism, were dependent upon their protectors, who were the religious orders. Okay. Let us be reminded that spirituality is a systematic practice of and reflection of a prayerful and devout and disciplined Christian life. And these are seen in the lives of the Beatas. In its practice, Christian spirituality has always called for an ascetical and prayerful life in which a spiritual guide and the light of the Holy Spirit help discern the direction in which the individuals and communities are being led. Thanks to the situation, thanks to the guidance of the religious orders, the Beatas, even though they were uncanonically recognized but protected by the Spanish monarch, they were able to define their role in the history of the Philippine Church and of the Filipino nation later on. That's why the grace of consecrated life is given not to all. I will repeat. The grace of consecrated life is given to all, not just to a selected few or race. As Mother Sebastiana, a Dominican Beata, would declare, vocation and holiness is for all the baptized, not for a selected race. And vocation to holiness is an invitation to all Christians, that is, to be holy just as the Lord is holy. And all Christians should be signs of contradiction to the world, and this is most of all the task given to the religious, which were also taken by the Beatas. Just as the church in our time is experiencing the tremendous influence of worldliness and hedonism, it has become the task of consecrated life to serve as a counterweight to a carefree attitude to the world. Any monastic community and the Philippine Beaterios are reminders that to all, that Christianity must maintain distance from the world or suffer the danger of secularization, which the Beatas did. They suffered for it, but because of their perseverance, they prevailed. Over the world, especially. And Nick Joaquin would describe this, that each Beaterio was just 10 judgment in Sodom, for whose sake the Lord would not destroy the city. That being cherished here is human community, the belief that Christians form such solidarity that some lack, others can make up for, and that the entire body draws help from the virtue of each member of the Beaterio. And this is what we call the doctrine of the communion of saints. The Beaterios live out that doctrine, and the Beati and the Beate foster the sense of community, which their later secular counterparts, the patriots of the revolution, would develop into a sense of a nation. But what would be the difference between the patriots of the Philippine Revolution and the Beatas, who were revolutionary mystics? This was the difference. First, the Beaterio movement, the first Filipina religious, their mind, even their turning away from the world, was not antisocial. Rather, they did see it as a social action, and not only in the sense that they work with their hands, but produced, taught the young, aided the sick, especially during the Philippine Revolution, and the needy, and strove to elevate the moral and tone of their times. But in the larger and mystical sense, balancing with their austerities against the backdrop of the extravagances and abuses found in the colonial society, whether Spanish or American, or even today. That's why, unlike the Filipino revolutionaries, the Filipina Beatas became icons of holiness that transcended race and culture. Moreover, the Beaterio movements were founded by the revolutionary mystics, and it did not have the Filipino mentality of Ningas Cogon. Thus, the Beaterio lasted beyond the Spanish colonial period. It survived the revolutions and the Second World War, for their founders were women of deep prayer and exercised a high degree of heroic virtues. Thanks to those native women, the trailblazers of the religious movement for women in the Philippines presented the canonical native congregation that were based upon their audacity and daring experiment. thanks to their daring audacity and experiment, no, they gave an example, or they gave examples to other women who were entering other congregations, the courage to pursue their vocation, rooted in prayer and their relationship with God. And this is the core role of the women religious in Philippine history that, no, the revolutionaries did not achieve. The revolution was a Ningas Kogon event. We are reminded only of the heroes on money and monuments. But the heroic efforts, the audacity of the Beatas can now be found in the present religious congregation of women, local congregation of women in the Philippines. Who were they? The Compañía the Beatas de la Compañía, no? Today, they are known as the RVM sisters, Religious of the Virgin Mary. RVM. No? Next, we have the Beatas de Santa Catalina de Siena. No? They are known today because they split into two groups. In 1933, the Missionaries de Santo Domingo, and the original group became the Siena Sisters. Okay. Then, Beatas de San Sebastián de Calumpang, founded in 1725. Now, in 1970, no, they celebrate their 50th anniversary as a congregation of pontifical right, the Agustinian Recollect Sisters in the Philippines. But during the American period in the 1930s, no, from this Beata, because they became a congregation of diocesan right only in 1929, and in the 1930s, foreign congregations were born from the Recollect Sisters of the Philippines. They were the Misioneras Agustinas Recolletas, and in China, the Agustinas Catequistas del Cristo Rey. Okay. And the Beaterio de Santa Rita de Pasig, no? Though founded in 1740, it was dissolved in 18. It was taken over the Hermanas Terciarias Agustinas by Mother Rita and Mother Consuelo Barceló, which later became known as the Agustinian Sisters of Our Lady of Consolation. And from this sister, another group separated, the Agustinian Missionaries, no? Under the late Mother Violeta Marcos. See, vocations will always flourish. No? God can write straight lines, no? Even though it is crooked along the way. And the Beateria Santa Rosa became a college. No? It was dissolved in 1866, taken over by the Daughters of Charity, Servant St. Joseph, and the Agustine Recollect Sisters from 1981 to the present. And the famous alumna of this Beaterio, which became Colegio de Santa Rosa, was the mother of Jose Rizal, Teodoro Alonso. And being a mother of a hero, reflected the beautiful formation she received from the Colegio de Santa Rosa, which at that time was called Beaterio de Santa Rosa. The American period and beyond, when Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States of America, the Patronato Real ended. With the new colonial masters, the Philippine Church enjoyed more freedom and growth. Because the United States, no, already by 1898, declared the separation of church and state. And for the first time, the Vatican, in 1899, was able to send its first apostolic delegate to check, really, what is happening to the Philippine Church at the end of the Patronato Real, no, in 1898. Now, what are the influence? What is the influence, the main influence of the Beatas to the Filipina sisters of the day? Remember, these are icons of Filipina holiness. First, perseverance in the religious life, especially when the congregation is international. Remember, whether we like it or not, there will be culture shock, language barriers, and worse, discrimination. We have to overcome this, and the Beatas are teaching us how to overcome these three obstacles in living the common life in the congregation. Number two, daring to go out of the comfort zone and receive formation outside. When the Americans took over, new congregations came in and began to recruit native vocations, but they received their formation outside of the Philippines. And these pioneering women in the new congregations, foreign congregations, dared the seeming impossible, to adapt, no, the culture of a congregation that is not Filipino. Number 3, those who persevered became instruments of vocations to their congregations. No? Today, who are filling up the empty convents of these congregations? Filipina sisters. Fourth, the Filipina sisters who were evangelized now in turn become evangelizers in Europe and the Americas. Fifth, they became educators of the youth. The Beaterios, once they became free from the patronato, what did they do? They become schools. They opened the as schools. No? St. Mary College under the RV and St. Rita College. No? La Consolacion College by the Assault Sisters. No? See, the development, the movement of the Spirit, that the sisters, no, are now the educators of the youth of today. No? They become ardent contemplatives of social justice. No? Meaning to say, they are social justice contemplative. They are fighting for the rights of others, yet they don't forget to pray. That's why they are revolutionary mystics and whose weapons are prayers in face of certain dangers. Only in prayer can we find God protecting us. Only in prayer can help us change ourselves and in the process help the conversion of others. That's why the sisters of today, learning from the Beatas, they are, we might call, contemplatives of social justice. Prayer is the root. Prayer is the strength. Only in prayer can we find transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Emil, for that substantial and insightful presentation. We will now take a 5-minute break. You can stretch or take our snack, and we will wait for your questions. You may type them in again in our chat box or in the comment section for those watching in Facebook or in the text mobile numbers that we gave you. We'll be back soon. Good morning again, Father Emil. We will now have the questions from our attendees.
Morning.
Father, our first question. What is the reason why the native Filipinas were not allowed to enter the monastery to become religious nuns? This question is from the OSR sisters.
Okay. Again, as I have presented before, it is because of the laws at that time. No? Natives were not allowed to enter the monastic life. No? Even at first, no, the priesthood, no, among men, native men. And because of this law, no, it was difficult for native women to enter the monastery de Santa Clara at that time. And even the prior provincial of the Franciscans, who is the spiritual director of the monastery, his hands were tied. And because of this, his hands were tied, he had to what? They had difficulty of accepting native women, no, to the monastery of Santa Clara. Not until the 1880s, no, when the Santa Clara monastery were allowed to let children, orphans, to stay in their monastery. They were orphans of the victim of the cholera epidemic. No? And somebody had to take care of these orphans. No? These are girls, no? Especially. And they began to accept, we might call lay sisters, no? Lay affiliates, to take care of the children. But they joined in prayer with this was a first step, no, for native Filipinas to enter the nunnery as lay affiliates, but they are not yet canonical nuns. So these were initial steps, no, for the monasteries to accept native women in the 1880s. The law was very clear, no, and even Mother Jeronima, the foundress, no, was rebuffed when she proposed to open a monastery for native women in Pandacan. when she was still alive. No, the law was very strong, and I see in the way we see it today is somewhat like a macho dominance, no, in the politics of the religious life in the Philippines. So that was the world vision at that time. So it was difficult even for the president. That's why only two native women were allowed to enter with certain conditions. And this condition, even though it was hard for them, they persevered. Unfortunately, only two became nuns in this 332 years of Spanish presence in the Philippines. So because of the Patronato Real and the Spanish laws that governed the church in the Philippines. Next question.
Recognized by the colonials but protected by the king. Wherein colonials belong to the Spanish monarch, what does this mean? So this is a clarification from the
Can you
Claretians.
repeat the question, sister, because it was blurred. Can you repeat the question?
The Beatas were not recognized by the colonials but protected by the king. Wherein the colonials belonging to the Spanish monarch, what does this mean?
Now, let us remember that the Patronato Real is under the governance of the king. In other words, the king was granted privileges, no, to run the church according to his will, no. And this was given to them by Pope. This right was given to the Spanish monarch by Pope Julius II. That eventually, that the king of Spain, the monarchs, are the patron, no, the patron of the church in the country. So whatever he says becomes law. The colonials in the Philippines were dependent on the laws coming from the king. That's why whenever a law is issued by the king, it will come in a certain form called the royal decrees. The royal decrees coming from the king dictates the will of the king's desire to have the Beatas protected as requested by the prior provincial. That's why the king, being the patron of the church, should not be contested by the Archbishop of Manila and the governor, because both the Archbishop of Manila and the governor were appointees of the patron, of the king. So that was the system of that time. What the king decides and issues a royal order, no, this has to be obeyed by both the Archbishop of Manila and, no, the Governor General. Both of them were colonials, no, they are Spaniards, and yet they are responsible to the King of Spain, who is the patron and the protector of the church in the colonies. Next question.
Our next question. It is very inspiring to note that even with the many restrictions and discrimination, yet the Beatas endured and persevered, were even icons of holiness. I am wondering, when did the women religious got their independence? What was the context that led to it? What led women religious to be out there doing apostolic work outside the convent? This is a beautiful inspiration for us women religious in our times now.
Now, full autonomy and canonical recognition came to the Beaterios only during the American period. That's why once the Spanish period ended with the signing of the Treaty of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898, the Patronato Real system and its corresponding laws were already abrogated, because the Americans are now the new masters in the Philippines. And since they maintain separation of church and state, the American colony could not anymore interfere in matters what are pertaining to the church. That's why, starting in the 1920s, the process of canonical recognition of the Beaterio began only in the 1920s particular. That's why all the beateros had to undergo a procedure by becoming a pious union or association. Then it would become a congregation of diocesan right, and later, the final process, it would become the, we might say, congregation of pontifical right. No? For example, the RVM sisters received their status as pontifical only after World War II, 1947. The Agustinian Recollect sisters of Santa Rita in Manila, just in front of San Sebastian, Manila, Basilica, no, they were elevated into a diocesan right in 1921, 1929. Then in 1970, they received their status of, we might say, pontifical right. So it is a process. It only began during the American period. But during the Spanish, it was quite impossible, no, because of the restricting laws that governed at that time. Thanks to the American period, by the grace of God, these beaterios are now congregations of Pope, and they are now directly under the Pope, not under the Congregation of Consecrated Life and Apostolic Life in the Vatican. No, that's why this is a blessing when the Americans came in. No, they dared to live as religious as if they were not canonically recognized by the Spaniards, but thanks to the protection of the king, they maintained their way of life under the care of the religious orders. But the fruit of their patience and perseverance were given only during the American period, when their foundresses were already dead, but their daughters carried on the memory of the foundresses when they became congregation of diocesan right, then congregations of pontifical right. And what they did first is to expand their apostolate through schools in the Philippines, the education of the youth. Because women, no, they were called the babaylans of the pre-Hispanic period. They are women who were ready to serve the barangays. Now, as consecrated women, they are willing to serve first the needs of the local church during the adjustment within the American period by opening up schools in the different parts of the Philippines. And from there, they started going out of the Philippines. So you do things one step at a time. That's why you need to read the signs of the times in order that the charism of each congregation should respond to the demands and the challenges of the time. That's why charism could be relevant if we adapt it to the signs of the times. And this is the challenge of the Beatas. They are not just visionaries. They are women of vision. Because visionaries talk about what they want in life, but they do nothing. But women of vision, they speak little, but they do much. I ask you, did the Beatas of the congregation live a diary? Did they live a spiritual testimony? Nothing. Very minimal. No? Many of our letters were already lost. No? Even though the letters were dead, the spirit of the letters of this, if they have written, are now alive in their spiritual daughters. And this is the challenge that we have to. Perfecte Caritatis reminds us, to know your charism, you read your constitutions. And adapt your constitutions to the signs of the times.
Thank you very much, Father, and thank you, Sister Alice, for that question. Next question from the Salesians. The patriots of the revolution learned to build a sense of nationhood from the Beaterios' example and witness of community. What do you think can we do as religious consecrated communities of women to help build a sense of nationhood, of patriotism among our people today?
Remember, these are Filipinas. Patriotism is a virtue, the love of country. No? The love of country. But the means of attaining the patriotism are different. The Philippine Revolution resorted to violence. While the Beaterios, and the Beatas resorted to prayer and Christian witnessing. These are two opposing factors. The Philippine Revolution built the nation, but it shed blood. But the Beaterios, build up a Philippine nation based, no, on their Christian witnessing and white martyrdom. They did not shed blood. They did not shed blood. However, they shed tears and sweat in order to build up a nation based on their witnessing. So, in other words, indirectly, the Beaterios are also contributors to nation building on the spiritual level. The spiritual level will always go beyond what is cultural, what goes beyond the historical. While the Philippine Revolution has only its time limits. That's why it is only limited to textbooks. But the revolution, the spiritual revolution of the Beatas are not limited in textbooks. They are leading testimonies lived by the sisters who are representing their foundresses. That is the difference between the nation building contributed by the Beatas than that from the Philippine Revolution of Emilio Aguinaldo and company. So that is the beautiful thing that we have to discover. No, the historical factor of the revolution had limits because it is within a time frame, while the Beatas is beyond time frame because it is life itself inspired by the Spirit. And the Spirit goes beyond time. And they are now found in every member of the congregation that are still serving the church today. And in serving the church in this way, they are building up a nation by guiding the youth.
Thank you very
Next
much,
question po.
Father. Another question from Sister Mary Lurazon. Given the history of the religious women, can you mention if there is any still some traces, positively or negatively, of the religious practices present in our religious life and how it affect our formation and mission in the Philippine church?
So it's hard for me to answer that question because these are regarding to the congregation. No, we call it the living tradition of each congregation, and that living tradition is tested by time. If it has limits. If it is a created factor within that time, or did it come from the Beatas, or did it come from the religious orders who were guiding the Beatas? So I could not answer that. No, what are the living traditions? But it is based on what we call the tradition of each religious code. That's why it needs discernment. That's why in Perfect Caritatis, no, the whole, it is the Magna Carta of renewal of religious life for all congregations. You have to examine your history. Your history is the anchor, no? That your congregation is like a ship, no? And without the anchor, no, your ship will be tossed and turned over by huge waves. Without an anchor, your anchor is your history, no? It gives you security because in spite of the big waves of experiments, no, your congregation would be safe because you are rooted of what the foundress or foundresses intend, or what did they intend, no, in establishing this community. That's why history is an anchor that gives you guarantee of who you are as a congregation. Your liturgical practices, your exercises of piety, no, came, no, how they responded in each historical period, but maintaining the spirit of foundresses. That's why you need discernment in doing that. That's why you have your provincial chapters, your general chapters. History is always the first topic. Are we faithful to the intentions of the foundresses? No. That's why I cannot answer what are the, because it depends upon each congregation. And unfortunately, I don't wear a veil. Hindi po ako madre. Hindi ko masasagot yan. No? Kayo po makakasagot yan. Know your history. No? Know your history. Kaya nga, sa amin po, no, in our recollect practice, pagkakaroon po ng isang 2-day retreat, no, tapos ang aming official historian magbibigay ng talk about our history para makalaman namin Are we respectful to the founders, the spirit of, and how are we adjusting the charism to the needs of the times? Kaya nga, ang first talk is history. Pag wala kayong history, ano mangyayari sa inyo? Chismology. Chismis. No? Please. So I cannot answer what are your practices that are valid this day because I am not a member of your congregation. So please, ask yourselves, do you know your congregation's true history, not chismology? Thank you.
Salamat po, Father. I think we got an assignment from Father. Okay, Father, another question here. Father, what do you think were the significant socio-political changes that led to the Philippinization of leadership in women religious congregations?
Okay. The Philippinization process began only in the 1950s. There was an initial movement by religious men. No? A Jesuit, Hilario Lin, no? An Agustinian Filipino, a Recollect Filipino, no? SBD Filipino, no? They gathered and petitioned Pope Pius XII, no, in a 90-page memorial asking the Pope to intervene to grant Filipino participation, greater Filipino participation in the governance of their own congregation. But since the majority of the members of the Adata in the late 1950s were foreigners, these were taken negatively. That was in the 1957. So they were silenced. And this pioneering move by these men, religious men, asking for greater responsibility in their own congregation were silenced. Vatican II came in 1960 to 1965. Perfecta came out, but the problem is there is a slow adjustment. There were slow adjustment of adapting what Perfecta Caritatis are asked. Yet there will be difficulties of accepting Filipinos, no, for greater responsibility in their congregation. It will take time, no. What are the? I will not say socio-religious. I said it's more on economics and demography. Population, no, is becoming smaller in Europe. That's
I think we have some problems with Father's signal. We'll just wait for him to return. While we wait for Father to come back, we can read some of the reflections here that were sent from Sister Happy. Filipina Beatas, icons of holiness, those in human authority could have their own standards and decisions based on their own context. But when God calls, there is always a way to respond to it. Thank you, Sister Happy, for that. Another observation here, I think from Sister Felisa. History is always taken into consideration to understand the present situation. With the current church regulations, it is easy to obtain church recognition, to start a group of sisters because, as per observation, there are many sprouting groups of sisters nowadays. Thank you po. Yan. So we have gone a very long way from bawal to now sisters' words are sprouting. So the Spirit is inspiring a lot. Also here, word of thanks, Father, very enlightening. It is good to go back to the past and see how God works in our life as a nation and in building our nation. From Sister Josefina, we are celebrating 500 years of Christianity. It would be good to have candidates for beatification on the basis of heroic virtues. So maybe we should start looking around in our community. So while you can continue to send your reflections, insights while we still wait for Father to come back. We have been cut.
Okay na po. Hello, hello.
Okay,
I,
Father,
okay na.
we can
Pasensya
hear
na.
you, Father.
Nawawala kami ng signal dito. Mahinang wifi namin. Pasensya na
Opo, so
po.
we have Father back.
Yes. Okay na po. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, Father, we can hear you clearly.
Okay. So, as I was saying ba na it's demographic, no? First, population is going down in Europe. These are one of the factors why Filipinos begin to take part of the greater responsibility of the congregation. Only in the 1990s, late 1990s, that we see Filipinas, no, are becoming generals of their own congregation. Only in the 1990s. Before that, it's difficult, no? Only in the year, we might say, between 1990 and 2000, no, we see men becoming generals of their congregation. The SBD from Bohol, and now a Dominican general is a Filipino. Again, it's more on demography, no? And if demography in Europe is getting smaller, they have to depend on the other provinces of their congregation where the vocation is much richer than theirs. Politics is always there. Discrimination is always present. No? Whites against colored. That will always exist because of racial superiority of one over the other. That is a very common phenomenon throughout the congregation. I myself experienced it. Ako isang Pinoy with many Spaniards. That's the way they saw us. What can we do? No. Now, in the Philippines, the international congregation based on, you are already thanks to Vatican II. Second, thanks to the demographic, the disasters happening in Europe, that Filipinas are now taking over. And secondly, another inspiration that we have to recognize is how the Catholic Church in the Philippines adapt and interpret, the Vatican teachings, the Vatican Council decrees, through our PCP to the second plenary council of the Philippines that was held 30 years ago. It ended in February. No, the question is, how much did we apply the acts and decrees of PCP2 in our congregation? And this is one of the factors why we're having more greater responsibilities in our congregation and the Philippinization process thanks to PCP2. No? And the acts of the CBCP that no candidate, aspirant should go out of the Philippines for their initial formation. They should begin here, and whenever they get out of the Philippines, they should have their simple profession. That's the condition. Because what happened that before that, those who were suffering from a culture shock would get out, and they were treated like consecrated domestics in other places. That was a tragic event in the history of the congregation, in the women congregation in Europe. So I said it's not political, not so, but demographic, and what is called the slow process of integrating Filipino women in the governance of their congregation. I believe it's more demographic rather than socio-cultural, because there are no more vocations in Europe. And somebody has to take care of the congregation, and who will be depending on Africans, Asians, Filipinos, and Latin Americans. The whites are already becoming a history because of what they're doing to their families today. Now, what is happening in Europe, demographically, it's becoming a reality in the Philippines. We might become the next victim. So we have to be aware of what is happening demographically in our country.
Thank you, Father. Maybe we can have our last two questions. Aside from spiritual guidance, what other helps did the male congregations offer to the Beatas in order to develop or grow in their communal and spiritual life?
Okay. During the Spanish period, the Beateria were given retreats and formation talks. Not only that, In the case of the Beaterio de San Sebastian, in order for the Beatas to have economic support, the Recollect Fathers gave them the right to take care of the image of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. They called the camareras, and to take care of the sacristy, wash beds and wash the linens, and so they could earn a living. So this is during the Spanish. I do not know the other congregations. Now, next, American period. What did the religious orders do to these beaterios? They assisted them in the process of becoming congregation of diocesan right. Because since they are a third order, the general from Rome had to come to the Philippines and talk with the Archbishop of Manila to undergo this process. The canonical process of transforming the beaterio into a canonical religious house by becoming first and foremost congregations of diocesan right, which our general in Rome, the Recollection, did to the Beatas of Beaterio de San Sebastian. That's why by 1929, they were already a congregation of diocesan right. So, examine, RDM sisters, the Sisters of Siena. They were all assisted by their spiritual directors, especially the general from Rome, in helping them to gain canonical status in the church. That's all.
Thank you, Father. For our last question, how did the Second Vatican Council impact religious life of women congregations in the Philippines?
Okay. But it's very important that the Magna Carta of our renewal of religious life, the Perfecte Caritatis, came under what we call it initiated other movements of renewal. And in this renewal, the sisters began to respond to the changes. That's why they call for extraordinary general chapters for the revision of the Constitution, the revision of their habits, and third, adapting their charism to the signs of the times as Gaudium et Spes demanded of us. So these three factors led women to adapt their charism, adapt their habits, as we might say, guidelines to adapt to the needs of the times. Remember, Gaudium et Spes, read the signs of the times are reminders for all of us, religious and laity, the hierarchy, that if we fail to read the signs of the times, our charism, our role in the church would become irrelevant. But however, never lose history, because the history will come a break for us, whether our revitalization, our renewal, is getting off course from the original charism of the foundresses. So Vatican II are just, we might say, giving us parameters in the way we should revitalize, in the way we should revive, renew our religious life in the adjusting to the signs of the times. Now, last word for me to all of you sisters, see to it that before you take an apostolate, you change something in your congregation, review your constitution. If you cannot review your constitution, there is a danger of getting off course from the intentions of your foundresses, and because the constitutions authenticate your role in the church, in the body of Christ. In other words, you have no floating status. You have a role to play in the church thanks to your constitution. That's why the juridical and the charismatic must go hand in hand in order for you to be, we might say, relevant in serving the needs of the local churches. That's why this is the contribution of Vatican II. It is the starting point of greater responsibility in the church. But remember, adjustments had to be made because the present culture, which is egoistic, macho mentality, will be the waves that we have to face every day in our society. But never lose hope, rooted in prayer, guided by history, you will overcome these difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I said that was the last question, but there is a pahabol po.
O pahabol, okay, no problem. I love pahabol.
What were the big challenges the women religious faced prior to Second Vatican Council and are still current realities and challenges?
Ay, nako po. Always, it will be always, I said before, the macho mentality of the times. No? Machismo. This is very strong. The male dominant mentality. No? In the church, we call it clericalism. No? In society, we call it macho mentality. No? The dominance of the men. Babae, the women should be only in three places: the homes, the church, and the market. Period. No? This is still a stereotype mentality that is still dominant today in our Filipino culture. But when you see a religious, no, magmamano kayo, yun ang alam nila. Pero beyond that, no, this is the thing that we have to go against, no, this wave of we call of discrimination against women. Last year, March 9, no, I was requested to celebrate Mass, no, in San Sebastian, no, again for religious women, no, and I reminded them we will always face the difficulties of discrimination and women abuse in our society because this is the machismo culture is very strong. Even though the PCP2 demanded justice for women and children, no, still in reality, no, we are not following the teachings of PCP2. Now, prior to Vatican II and after the Vatican, this is we might say, stereotype, no, problems that every congregation of women is facing today. Discrimination. On the part of the church where clericalism is very strong, on the part of the society where machismo mentality is also strong. How to overcome it, I cannot give you a silver bullet for the solution. Because these are conditions that were done for centuries. It will take more than a century to mellow down this mentality that is anti-women and anti-Christian. The work is still great before us. That's all.
Father, a follow-up question on the follow-up question.
Okay, no
What
problem.
can you recommend to women religious to overcome that machismo mentality?
Okay. So I asked, one time I was talking to the sisters. I will not mention what congregation. I will not mention any congregation. Baka mabuking ako. So about the problem, in some dioceses, no, may mga bishops, some bishops, not all, na gustong kunin ng properties ng mga madre, ng kanilang kongregasyon. Sabi ko, sister, with regard to faith and morals, religion, you obey your parish priest, you obey your bishop. Okay. But regard to the property of the congregation and money, be careful. These priests and bishops are also human beings. Remember, you are a congregation of pontifical right. If this property belongs to you, wala kayong karapatan ibigay ang titulo ng lupa sa isang obispo demanding because you are under the Pope, no longer under the bishop. Paglaban nyo yan. Karapatan nyo yan. Huwag kayo baw ng baw. No? Hindi tayo aso bawaw na lang. No? You have your constitution. The constitution gives you right to your private property of your congregation. Pagtanggol nyo yan. Kung paalisin kayo ng obispo, hindi nila pwedeng kunin yung property because ang titulo nasa inyo. No? So, remember, whenever the church speaks of faith and morals, obey. No? The diocesan policy or with regard to your apostolate, no, adjusting your apostolate to the demands of the pastoral directives of the diocese, obey. But with regard of maintaining your property, if that property belongs to you, your school, your convent, the bishop and the parish priest, they have no right to take them away from you. Remember, every apostolate between the diocese and the congregation must be done with a memorandum of agreement. That is now, it should be done today. Memorandum of agreement to avoid confusion, to avoid abuse. So yung in-advise ko sa isang kongregasyon, kaya mag-ingat kayo kapag perang pinag-usapan. Ang obispo at pare, tao rin yan. No? Tao rin yan. That's why as a congregation of pontifical right, no, you cannot surrender your property to a local diocese. No? As if you're surrendering your sovereignty, no, that the Pope has given you to a local bishop because you're under the Pope, not that under the local bishop with regard to the way you maintain your property and hold your congregation. That's yours, given by the Pope. Now, if you're a diocesan, a congregation of diocesan, but yes, you're under you have to obey your bishop because your bishop is your protector. But once you become a congregation of pontifical right, the bishop, with regard to your spirit, your cloister life, the bishop has no business. Period. Magalit sa akin ng mga obispo, but I'm speaking in terms of what canon law defines. Bato-bato sa langit, tamaan ng magagalit, ang magalit ay pangit. Sorry to say.
Salamat po, Father. So we are vowed, consecrated persons, but we should be discerning when to bow. Sabi ni Father, we should not bow, no?
Bawa na.
Yan, good reminder for all of us.
Pero remember, no? Defend the rights of your congregation as pontifical right. Period.
Thank you, Father, for that. Speaking of pontifical, a question here. Pope Francis is all-out support in the protection of children and women against violence and abuses done to them. Can you comment on the history of sexual abuse committed by the clergy in the Philippines, in old history and now?
Recently, I'm reading some historical documents that there were already abuses committed by some, not all, some priests in Intramuros. And these priests were investigated by the Archbishop of Manila. Oh. So, the problem is perennial. Now, how to handle this, we might say, sexual abuses, guidance were already given by the Vatican to the bishops. No? And one more thing, no? If abuses happen, no? First, no? You have to talk with the victim. If that victim is telling the truth, or you have to discern, no? Before you go to the higher ups, no? In order to complain that this priest abused this victim. So, you have to corroborate whether the victim is telling the truth or not. No? That's the thing. But if there are proofs and there are witnesses, that's the time you take side on the victim before you go to the higher ups. No? So there is already a due process on that. Because a bishop who fails to report sexual abuse will be penalized by the Vatican. That's what's happening in the United States right now. No? So, you have to talk it over. Huwag niyong pagalitan yung biktima. First, establish the facts. Establish the facts. And see to it if she's telling the truth or he or she is telling the truth. If it is already the truth, that's the time you take the due process. I cannot tell you right now because I do not know the due process. You have to ask a canonical expert on that, no? Which is already given instruction from the Vatican on how to handle, no, sexual abuse cases in the church or in the congregation. Nasa sa inyo po yan. Okay? So again, we need prudence. And secondly, once prudence is the truth is already established, then action should be taken. Without jeopardizing the name of the victim and the abuser. Only three things: the congregation, the abused, and the church authorities. Kasi ang nangyayari po, hina-hype ng media ang storya. No? We should not be victims of media abuse and media lies. They are hyping it out of proportion. We have to protect the integrity of the victim, the name of the abuser, and the name of the congregation. But due process must be done. So yun lang po ang aking masasabi. But I cannot give you the process because I am not a canonist. I'm just a church historian. Yun po.
Maraming salamat po, Father. So, napadami yung, mas mahaba ata yung, madami ata ang pahabol na
Ay, wala.
questions.
Panay ako dyan sa mga habol. Oo, habol. Kasi history. History. Maraming pahabol. No problem. I love interchanging because the talk is very short, 45 minutes lang. Magandang i-expand natin beyond the talk because I love being asked questions. It is the way I exercise my mental kalisipan. Hindi ako magka-Alzheimer.
Salamat po, Father. Do we have time for another question? Father, you talked about prayer. Sabi niya, if prayers can transform, does it mean that we are not really praying so hard or our prayers are not enough? As we are the only Christian country in Asia, government, people are not transformed. What happened?
Well, it is not just prayer that we have to after. No. The prayer is the way for enlightenment. But remember, no, the human person is a very mysterious person. Mahirap nating because of that, you need in reforming a person, it has to be reconditioned. The mindset. Mahirap po yan. Second, no, the system of how the system, the way of life that has been prevailing in the Philippines that we failed to check. So, the way we live today, we're already conditioned in the past that we failed to check when those abuses were beginning to prop up. Now, the abuse is already embedded. Graft and corruption are already embedded in our society. It will take centuries, no, to take them out. What we need to do is to minimize this graft and corruption. I have to confess, we all fail to form Christian conscience in our students, in our educational apostolate. We just informed them, but we did not transform them in the way we should think as Christians. When you inform a person, that's nothing. But when you transform a person through formation, that is the way education should do today. Secondly, now because of the demand of the system of graft and corruption, many good-willed Christians who took up the office had to resign. Marami nag-resign. Why? They don't want to be wallowed up by the system. The system that favors graft and corruption, no, gives the danger of being wallowed up. Either you go against or you go with it. And many do not want to go with it. Many resign to their positions. In the government, I knew some. They were really good Catholic and good Catholic Christians. That's why praying is good. No? Praying is the starting point of something of how to do things as the Lord wills us to do. Kaya nga may kasabihan si Bishop Bacani, meron tayong pananampalataya. Ang pananampalataya ng isip ay paniniwala na may Diyos. Ang pananampalataya ng puso, the faith in the heart, is trusting in the Lord, pagtitiwala. But what the most important is applying of what we prayed for is action. Pagtalima. The prayer, the faith of the hands and the feet. Applying of what we have received in prayer. Gifted to give is the challenge of today. But we know what to give. But the question, how to give it? Because of our prevailing graft and corruption in society. We know our gift, the faith. But how to give the faith by living it, that is the challenge that we have to face today. Yun ang po masasabi ko.
Maraming salamat, Father. I think that's really our question. And thank you, Sister Nenet, for that last question. To all our attendees, thank you very much for your active participation. Before we end this webinar, may I once again call on Sister Nympha for the acknowledgements and words of gratitude.
All good things come in three. I hope all of you here will agree with me that today's webinar that brought us back to the beginnings of our Christian faith has been a meaningful experience. Today's experience would not have been possible without the help of so many people. We would like to thank Father Emil Quilatan, OAR, who has been so generous as to give us his precious time today in this webinar, the Association of Major Religious Superiors of the Philippines, who helped us in the dissemination of the information about this webinar, the technical staff of St. Paul University, Quezon City, and St. Paul University, where we are running this webinar. Also, I would like to thank the Execom of the AWFP, and to you, dear participants, join us again next Saturday for the second webinar.
Thank you, Sister Nympha, for some announcements. Our next webinar will be next Saturday, February 20, same time, 9:30 a.m. with our topic, Women Religious of the Philippines Gifted to Give. If today you have experienced difficulty watching the webinar via Facebook, we encourage you to join via Zoom in the next two webinars. And for those who are interested, we will be posting on our Facebook page, AWFP group, the recorded file of today's webinar. So see you next Saturday. We shall now have the closing prayer.
We stand before the grand horizon.
500 years of faith, grateful today.
We bear the gift of mission.
Totally yours, we give ourselves, faithfully yours until the end.
To your mission, Lord.